Hello everybody, I'm Kat, and welcome to a very late wrap-up. I started these quarterly wrap-ups in order to kind of hold myself accountable and kind of have a pattern to filming wrap-ups, especially because sometimes in a month I don't read a lot, other times in a month I'll read a lot, and my reading pattern is kind of unpredictable. So I wanted to start these quarterly wrap-ups, so like every 3 months I would film a video talking about the books I've read recently. You guys would get the gist of it, we'd all move on. However, my last quarterly wrap-up was back in January or February, I don't know, it was earlier this year. So I haven't really done a good job at filming these quarterly wrap-ups. I am still gonna follow kind of the quarterly timeline as best as I can. So this wrap-up is going to consist of the books that I read mainly in like March, April, and May of earlier this year. I'm gonna have a separate wrap-up talking about the books that I read this summer, and then hopefully in December I will actually be up to date with these quarterly wrap-ups and I'll talk about the books I read this fall. But without further ado, I'm gonna jump into this. These are the books I read earlier this year. Let's get into it. So the first book I have here is kind of a disappointment, and that is 99 Days by Katie Cotugno. Okay, so this book follows this girl named Julia. Hello, hi, editing Kat here. I'm realizing now that the main character of 99 Days is not named Julia. Yeah. Ooh, also the lighting is really bad. And she's kind of recovering from this huge social scandal that happened involving her the previous summer. It actually resulted in her moving from town and going to a boarding school in a completely different state, just so that way she wouldn't have to deal with the repercussions of her own actions, essentially. And when she returns to this town in this book, she kind of realizes how certain people grasp onto certain scandals and how other people just kind of move on and forget, especially if they weren't involved. Much like pretty much every human ever, Julia finds herself making the same mistakes over and over again and wondering, history does repeat itself. That's kind of the best way I can put this. I talk about this book more in depth in my pop culture readathon that I did back in January. So if you want to hear like a better summary of this book, go check that out. I will say content warning for this one for bullying, especially verbal bullying and cheating. So this book really wasn't for me. Going into it, I really wasn't in the mood, which didn't really help my enjoyment of it. There was really nothing likable about this book. The characters weren't likable. The situations that they put themselves in weren't likable or relatable, and I don't know, I just didn't like this book at all. But with that being said, it's still not nearly as bad as some of the other YA contemporaries I read, so I ended up giving it 2 stars. I set the bar in hell for this one, and it kind of passed, barely. Definitely not a favorite of mine. I honestly kind of forgot I read this book, and it wasn't until I looked back and realized, oh yeah, I read that book earlier this year. The next book I read was The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. This book follows this girl named Xiomara as she is coming of age. She's discovering that she really loves poetry. She really wants to join her school's slam poetry club, but she's kind of worried about what her parents will think. And so it's kind of like a coming of age story. It involves, you know, poetry and art, and it was so good. So good. My only complaint about this book is that I just wanted more. I could have read 100 more pages of this book. I really, really loved it. I was hoping for a little bit more complexity in the side plots as well. I wanted a little bit more substance to them, but other than that, I really have no other complaints. It's really, truly a beautiful, perfect book. I read most of this book in one sitting. It was such a fast read, and it was just so well done. And I really want more debut books to be like this one, because I know that this is Acevedo's debut book. I wish more debut books were like this one because it was phenomenal. I gave this one 4 stars. I really, really loved it. The next book I read was With the Fire on High, also by Elizabeth Acevedo. Initially, I gave this book 3.5 stars, but looking back, I'd give it 4. Out of all of Elizabeth Acevedo's books that I've read, this one is probably my favorite, even though initially I didn't love it, which is kind of interesting, but I'll explain. The biggest issue I had with this book initially while I was reading it was the lack of tension. There wasn't really a concrete like plot line that this book followed. The romance wasn't really something I was into. I just wanted a little bit more while I was reading it. However, this book is very, very realistic, and that's why this book has stuck with me. Like looking back on all of Elizabeth Acevedo's books, because I read all of them back in February, March, this book has stuck with me the longest because the circumstances that the characters go through is so real. The characters just stuck with me because they were so real. Honestly, it's probably my favorite of Elizabeth Acevedo's books because it's left such a lasting impact on me that I didn't initially have when I read it. So I'm gonna change my rating to 4 stars because frankly, it was a really, really well done book. Just at the time I read it, it wasn't doing it for me, if that makes any sense, but it's left a lasting impact on me, so I'm gonna bump up the rating. As I've mentioned in several of my videos, I have a lot of videos coming your way that are sitting unedited on my computer, and the reason I haven't gotten around to editing them is honestly, I've been really busy this summer working, and on the days that I have off, I've been having really bad migraines. I think I've mentioned this before, but I suffer with chronic migraines and I live on the West Coast, and with all the smoke and the fires that have been going on, it's just been a hard time, honestly. It hasn't been fun, so I haven't really been feeling well when I have time to edit videos, and so in result, I have a lot of footage sitting on my laptop. But one of them is a reading vlog, and I'm so excited to edit this one and upload it because it's something I've wanted to do for months. I had this reading vlog planned in mind, and so I really, really want to get it out into the world. Coming up here, I'm going to talk about some of the books and that was in that reading vlog. So yeah, that's why I'm mentioning it. So this next book, bear with me, is The Spring Girls by Anna Todd. You're gonna notice a pattern here and you're probably gonna guess what that reading vlog is about. But anyway, this is a modern day Little Women retelling, and surprisingly, I gave it 2.5 stars. I was actually genuinely surprised at how enjoyable this was. For a second, I thought I was gonna give it 3 stars, but then I realized, no, it's a 2.5 star book. Come on. Sit down. The biggest issue I had with this book was Meg's character. If we're talking about Little Women retellings, Meg has the potential to be a really complex character. That's something I really love about the 2019 adaptation of Little Women, is the fact that they flesh Meg out and you realize that she's more than just, I want a husband, you know? There's more to that than just a girl who wants to get married. And that's what I love about the 2019 adaptation of Little Women. That's what I love about the original source material of Little Women, is the fact that yes, all of the girls kind of have these different dreams in mind of what they want their lives to become. It gets fleshed out really well in Little Women, and I feel like the 2019 adaptation does a really great job of showing that. This book did not. Her development in this retelling really fell flat, and it relied upon this really weird, pointless love triangle that I just couldn't get behind. I really didn't understand what was going on, to be honest. I also wish Amy was fleshed out more as well. Amy is the only sister in this book that doesn't get a point of view. This book kind of switches between the perspectives of Jo, Meg, and Beth, and I really wish that we got Amy's perspective because in this book, honestly, she's just kind of like the annoying younger sister side character, and Amy is so much more than that. We all know this. Amy March is more than just an annoying sister. Come on. And so I really wish that Anna Todd kind of fleshed her out more, but really truly Amy's only there to kind of say a funny line or just to annoy the older sisters, which kind of sucked. I also wished Laurie was bigger in this book. In the original Little Women story, Laurie is kind of like the March brother. He is a huge part of the March family, and in this book, honestly, he's just kind of known as Jo's best friend slash potential boyfriend. We don't really see his character flesh out. We don't see him have the same relationship with the sisters that he does in the original material, and I really wish that that was done the same way because Laurie is such a great character, and in this book he really doesn't play the same role that he does in the original. So those were kind of the biggest issues I had with this book. To be honest, there were more liberties taken with this retelling, but I just didn't care. There were moments where the writing was definitely very iffy, especially when Anna Todd described some of the background characters and during the more intimate moments, because this is Anna Todd we're talking about. And there were moments where the writing was kind of ugh, I kind of cringed while reading this book because some of the writing was just not up to par. You know, overall, it was better than After. And After We Collided, because I've read both. I did actually listen to the audiobook. I checked out the audiobook through Libby, and I think the audiobook kind of helped lessen the blow of the awkward writing. But this is definitely the best thing I've read by Anna Todd, and it probably will stay that way, even though I gave it 2.5 stars and it still really wasn't that good. If you're someone who likes Anna Todd's writing, you should pick this up because, I mean, for Anna Todd standards, it was actually, you know, decent. Otherwise, honestly, I wouldn't really recommend this. personally. Next, I read everyone's favorite adaptation of 2021, and that is Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo. Believe it or not, I've never actually read a Leigh Bardugo book until I picked up Shadow and Bone earlier this year. Honestly, I gave this book 3.5 stars. I wasn't really that blown away by it. I think it's because I read plenty of young adult fantasy that kind of came out in the early 2010s, and I'm kind of over that now. Honestly, in a lot of ways, this book reminded me of The Cruel Prince, where nothing much happens plot-wise. It sets up a lot of development and world building, but the thing that The Cruel Prince had that this book didn't was a killer romance. Not to sound like everyone on Book Talk, but The Cruel Prince did it for me. I'm sorry, it must be said. This is the first book. I am looking forward to seeing how the trilogy expands, but I have also heard kind of mixed things about the 2 books that follow, so I don't know. I haven't picked up Siege and Storm yet, and I don't know if I'll finish that this year or if I'll pick it up next year, to be honest. I did listen to this mainly on audiobook, and that was the #1 way I got through this book. The next book I read was Clap When You Land by Elizabeth Acevedo. I gave this one 4 stars, and I honestly feel like I'm doing it dirty by not giving it 5, but to be honest, I really wasn't in the mood for this book. I picked it up because I really wanted to read all of Elizabeth Acevedo's books earlier this year because so many people had talked about them last year, and I wanted to jump on the trend. I just read this book honestly at the wrong time, and so that's why I gave it 4 stars. It dealt with a lot of topics that kind of hit close to home, and I just really wasn't in the mood for that. But it's really beautifully written, it's heartbreaking, and the audiobook is phenomenal. So I give it 4 stars just because it wasn't for me, but it was still really phenomenal. It's probably honestly my least favorite Elizabeth Acevedo book just because my reading experience with it just wasn't up to the enjoyment level as it was for The Poet X. I think that's the one I enjoyed reading the most. And in terms of sticking with me, it just hasn't stuck with me quite the same way that With the Fire on High has. Even though this is like everyone's favorite, this is probably my least favorite book by Elizabeth Acevedo. There are a lot of other factors that kind of influenced my opinion, but I still gave it 4 stars. Like, who am I kidding? Next, I read Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy. This is a middle grade graphic novel, and this is one of the best books I read all year. This is exactly how you write a modern retelling. I didn't really know what to expect going into this because I finished The Spring Girls and it was kind of bad, to be honest. And so I didn't know how this graphic novel was going to handle the story of Little Women and the retelling of it, but it handled it so well. My mind was blown reading this. This retelling is absolutely perfect. This is exactly how I would imagine a modern retelling of Little Women to be. The way the characters were adapted and kind of fit into the modern world we live in was so perfect. I loved every single March sister. They all stayed so true to the original characters, and I loved that the authors did not do any of the March sisters dirty, unlike the Spring Girls, and I really appreciated that. If you love Little Women, pick this up. If you love graphic novels, pick this up. This is actually technically, I believe, a middle grade graphic novel because I actually bought it. It was in the middle grade section of Barnes & Noble because I just so happened to be walking through it and I saw this and I was like, let's do it. Let's read this. Phenomenal. I would recommend this if you like know young readers who are getting into graphic novels. Perfect. Brilliant. I loved it. The next book I have here is another catastrophic disappointment, and that is Jo and Laurie by Melissa De La Cruz and Margaret Stohl. I gave this book 1.5 stars. It was that bad. I actually enjoyed Anna Todd's retelling more than this book, which I think speaks volumes. This was Little Women fanfiction in like the worst way possible. I'm really disappointed in this story. I was actually looking forward to it because I did read Melissa De La Cruz's Alex and Eliza, which is like a retelling of Alexander Hamilton and his relationship with Elizabeth Schuyler. And I read that years ago, and maybe it was because like it was during the Hamilton craze, and much like everyone else on BookTube, I was in, you know, the midst of obsessing over it. And I read that book and I thought it was cute for what it was. And so I was looking forward to this because I saw Melissa De La Cruz's name and I remembered how much I enjoyed reading that. And so I did have some decent expectations for this, but oh boy, it did not meet up. Nothing about this book is enjoyable. It's very, very boring. Every relationship felt forced. The writing was mediocre at at best. And it's really not a romance, and it really felt more forced than Joe and Laurie's relationship in the original Little Women. In the original story, there's at least some tension between Joe and Laurie, like you understand. There's a bit of a will they, won't they, until you realize no they won't. But in this story, it just felt so forced. Like Joe was just not into Laurie and Laurie wasn't that into Joe, and it really wasn't at all good. Joe's relationship with her sisters felt really forced, and what was going on with Mr. March and why was he the cookie cutter fanfiction absent dad? Where did that come from? Come on. None of the characters or the relationships in this novel just made sense. I'm really sad to give this less than 2 stars. I actually was looking forward to reading this, but it really just wasn't for me. I would definitely not recommend this to anyone, and despite the fact that I really like the cover, I really did not like the contents. So the next book I have here is none other than Chain of Iron by Cassandra Clare. Now, I actually have a lot of videos, well not a lot, but I have like 2 videos coming out where I talk in depth about this book, so I'm not really going to talk much about it here. I enjoyed it more than Chain of Gold, which I think is an unpopular opinion. I just love sequels. I'm just a person who appreciates sequels. So I actually really enjoyed this more than Chain of Gold. I gave it 4.5 stars. Yeah, I enjoyed it more than Chain of Gold. I thought it was really fun. It was so comforting revisiting this world. I just felt so comforted when I turned on that audiobook and it said, Simon & Schuster Audio Presents. The amount of serotonin that hit my brain hearing that honestly was unmatched. I will never know any sort of happiness like that until Chain of Thorns comes out. Next we have Sloppy Firsts by Megan McCafferty. The thing with Sloppy Firsts is I was actually given an e-arc of it through NetGalley. Signing up for NetGalley was something I have been looking forward to for years, but I wasn't old enough, and so this year I was finally old enough to make a NetGalley account. And this was the first book that a publisher approved me to read, and I was so excited until I read it, and I hated it. It's hands down one of the worst books I've ever read. So Sloppy Firsts follows this girl named Jessica Darling during her sophomore year of high school, and she's going through some growing pains. Her best friend has moved away, following kind of a really bad family tragedy that the best friend went through. So she's moving out of town to kind of heal and get away from the people that kind of caused this tragedy, and it leaves Jessica Darling in a state of woe. And throughout the book you kind of see Jessica Darling just act very cynically for no reason, and she ends up striking up a romance with the person who's directly involved with her best friend's tragedy. So there's that. But anyway, I gave this book 1 star. Shout out to NetGalley because this is the first review I ever wrote for them. And thank you to St. Martin's Press for approving me and taking a chance on a small booktuber who absolutely trashed this book. Right off the bat, I was not in the mood for this book. Are you sensing a theme here? Because I am. Jessica's voice was way too cynical for my taste. I didn't care about any of the other characters. They were all very 2D flat stereotypes, and I didn't care. Then there's the issue of Marcus, and Marcus is kind of advertised as like the bad boy. He does drugs, he's an addict, and the way addiction is handled in this book is like super problematic. There are healthy ways to show a character be an addict, and I think like Rue from Euphoria is a great way of showing how there are more sides to a person than just their addiction, and this book doesn't do that at all. But the way Marcus's addiction is perceived by Jessica is very stereotypical and dehumanizing. I was disgusted reading about his addiction through Jessica's point of view. He was also easily the most interesting character in this book because he had the potential to have a lot of depth, but he wasn't developed at all. He's just consistently the same throughout the book. The Marcus you meet in chapter 1 is the same Marcus in the last chapter. He doesn't go through any sort of development. And the ending is straight out of Wattpad. It's almost exactly the same ending as the one in After. I wish I was kidding. Part of me was hoping that the ending would be a little bit more closed because it is the first book in a series, but sadly it's literally left open-ended. Like After. If you've read After, you kind of know what I'm talking about. If you've seen the movie After, I guess you kind of know what I'm talking about, but the movie After provides a little bit more closure. This book literally ends exactly like After. I wish I was making this up. I wish I was, but I'm not. No, it's there. It's published. So I was genuinely expecting something else from this book. When I was younger, I read the middle grade Jessica Darling books. I believe they were called like the It List, and I thought I enjoyed them. but reading this book made me kind of remember those books, and I realized I did not really enjoy them that much. I definitely thought that with this book being a republication, because Sloppy Firsts originally came out about 20 years ago, so I definitely thought that some of it would be updated. I know that there was another book that was recently republished a few years ago, and the author actually went through and changed a lot of the pop culture references to make it relevant to today and like today's generation who is reading it. And I thought that something like that would be similar, like the author would go through and kind of update it, but that's not the case. This book is the same book that was published 20 years ago. It just has a different cover now. The only new parts about this book is there's a foreword by Rebecca Searle, which I honestly didn't care for, and an apology disguised as an author's note by Megan McCafferty. She had the ability to rewrite and re-edit parts of her book, but instead she decided to write an author's note that was literally an apology for the harmful stereotypes that she displayed in this book. When I read that author's note, the amount of anger that just surged through me, I was so angry. Like, oh my gosh. And I'm not someone who gets angry very easily, and I'm just not really an angry person, but reading that author's note, literally like flames of anger engulfed me. I was so angry. I am really bummed though, because this is the first arc ever that I got through NetGalley. I was looking forward to it because I did have a past with Jessica Darling, but let's just say that I'm not having a future with her anytime soon. The next book I read was actually one I read for my science fiction course, and that is 1984 by George Orwell. This book takes place in a kind of futuristic society, and it kind of follows the idea that with kind of the growing amount of technology, people are constantly being watched, and the government is constantly monitoring the people that live in this society to the point where like they will notice if like your body language is slightly different, and they will have a word with you about that. I don't know if you know this about me, but I'm a part of the Generation Z. Being a part of Gen Z means I've grown up surrounded around technology. When I was about 5 years old, my parents got the first iPhone, or like one of the first iPhone models. Ever since, like my life has been surrounded with technology, cameras, all of that stuff. And so reading this book, for like the first 2/3 of it, I was just kind of like, okay, maybe I am, you know, a product of my generation. It really wasn't shocking to me, like reading about all of the technology in this book. But then I read the last third of it. Yeah, no, this book still does have that shock factor value to it. I gave it 3 stars, and I stand by that. It's just a lot to process. Like if you've read this book, it's a lot to process. It really makes you think. All right, and the next book I'm going to talk about today is 10 Truths and a Dare by Ashley Elston. Sadly, I DNF'd this book at about 37% in. This is another book I got through NetGalley, so shout out to NetGalley and Disney Hyperion for approving me. I see the type of people you are. Thank you. So this book follows this girl. It's her senior year of high school. It's like her last week of high school, and she's about to graduate. She knows what college she's going to. She has her whole future planned out, and then she gets the notice that she doesn't have a PE credit, and if she doesn't get this credit waived somehow, she can't graduate. Now for me, this is like something I could relate to, because if I had a missing credit, it would be PE. So anyway, this book I did DNF. However, I really enjoyed the parts I read, and I really loved like this over-the-top plot, because is it unrealistic? Yeah, but it was still really fun, and I really have nothing against this book except that I wasn't in the mood for it. Another thing was I made the mistake of reading this book without reading 10 Blind Dates, and this book follows the same family that was in 10 Blind Dates, and so I was dropped in and all of these characters appeared at once, and I was just so confused. I imagine that that's how people feel like jumping into Chain of Gold without reading a single Cassandra Clare book, because there were so many people introduced all at once, and I just didn't have the time or the brain capacity to process it. I didn't know who was who. It was difficult trying to keep track of who was Olivia's cousin, Olivia the main character, or who was Olivia's school friend. It all began to blur more and more as I continued to read, and that's kind of what made the story unenjoyable for me, and that's kind of why I stopped reading it. I'd love to give this book a second chance though. I do obviously want to read 10 Blind Dates though before I jump back into this, just so that way I have a better understanding of what exactly I'm getting into. There was just so many characters introduced at once, and it was just really overwhelming for me. And on that terrible disappointment, I'm afraid it's time to end. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in my part 2 to this video, I guess. Since this was my spring quarterly wrap up, I'll see you in my summer one. Bye!